His dog stood perfectly still in the middle of the dark hall nose, pointed at the stone fireplace, like a compass finding true north. Not shaking, not whimpering, just locked on every muscle drawn tight beneath that black and tan coat ears pitched forward, tail frozen mid-air as though the air itself had told him to wait. It was not fear. It was urgency. The same urgency the dog showed every single time Callum Brecker was about to fall apart. Every time the nightmares dug in too deep. Every time the silence grew so heavy, it pressed the air from his lungs. Shadow always knew before Callum did. Always placed himself between his partner and the edge. But this was different. Something behind that wall of stone had been waiting. 15 years. Waiting for someone broken enough to understand what was hidden there, and brave enough to pull it into the light. And the dog knew. Before any human in that house, the dog already knew. Tell us where you are watching from today. Leave a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. The wind had a way of finding every crack in the trailer walls. It came through the seams at night, like cold fingers reaching for something to grab, rattling the thin aluminum until the whole structure shuddered on its cinder blocks. On bad nights, Callum swore the walls breathed. On the worst nights, he could not tell whether the shaking came from the wind or from somewhere inside his own chest. He lay on the narrow cot with his boots still on, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had spread over the years into a shape like a map of nowhere. Sleep had stopped being a friend a long time ago. It visited sometimes briefly the way a stranger might stop at your door to ask for directions and leave without looking back. Most nights, Callum just lay there, counting the spaces between gusts of wind and hoping none of them sounded like gunfire, hoping that tonight would be the night the memories stayed in their corners. They never did. He was 52 years old. His face carried the years the way mountain rock carries weather in deep lines and hard shadows that told their story without asking permission. His knees ached in the cold, the left one far worse than the right, a deep, grinding pain that lived in the joint, like a tenant who refused to leave. It changed everything. The way he walked, the way he stood from chairs slow and deliberate, one hand bracing against whatever was nearest. The way he lowered himself onto the cot each night, breathing through his teeth. It was the first thing he felt every morning, and the last thing he felt every night. Some men carried their wars in their minds. Callum carried his in his bones, in the grinding of cartilage that no longer existed in every step he took across the frozen ground. Outside, the Wyoming plains stretched flat and white under a low winter sky. Snow had fallen before dawn, covering the yard, the fence posts, the rusted pickup truck beside the trailer. Everything looked clean from a distance. Up close, it was all just cold. Cold and quiet and endless, the way loneliness looks when it has enough room to spread out. Shadow lay at the foot of the cot, curled tight with one ear raised even in sleep. A German shepherd 7 years old with a broad chest built for work and a scar along his left shoulder where shrapnel had torn through fur and muscle in a place neither of them spoke about anymore. His muzzle had begun to gray along the edges, the way autumn touches the tips of leaves before taking the whole tree. There was dignity in that gray. It said this dog had earned every year. Whenever Callum flinched in sleep, whenever his breathing hitched or his hands curled into fists, Shadow would shift. Not dramatically, just enough. A nose pressed against a wrist. A chin settling onto a knee. A steady heartbeat offered without being asked for, without expecting anything in return. That was the deal between them. Had been since Afghanistan. Callum kept Shadow fed. Shadow kept Callum alive. Neither of them needed a contract. Some bonds are written in blood and silence, and those are the ones that hold. A sudden bang from outside, just the loose siding catching the wind, sent Callum bolt upright. His hands shook before his eyes were open. His heart slammed against his ribs like something caged trying to break free. The trailer walls seemed to lean inward. The shadows in the corners shifted and reached. For 3 terrible seconds, he was not in Wyoming. He was somewhere hot and loud where the ground shook and voices screamed orders that came too late. Shadow was already on his feet, not barking, never barking during these moments. What Callum needed was not noise. What he needed was weight, presence, something warm and real to hold him to the floor beneath his boots. Shadow pressed his full body against Callum's leg, 70 pounds of muscle and loyalty, leaning in without hesitation. Then he rested his head on Callum's thigh and breathed. Slow, deep, steady, a rhythm as reliable as a heartbeat, as constant as the tide. Callum placed his trembling hand on Shadow's neck, felt the pulse beneath the fur, matched his breathing to the dog's. In when Shadow breathed in, out when Shadow breathed out. "Just the wind," he whispered. His voice sounded far away. "Just the wind." The shaking slowed. The walls straightened. The shadows settled back into their corners. Shadow stayed pressed against him until Callum's hands went still, and even then waited 3 more breaths before pulling away. Always 3 more. As if he had learned that the first calm was never trustworthy, that you had to wait for the second and the third before you could believe the storm had passed. Callum scratched behind Shadow's ear. The dog leaned into it, eyes half closing, and for one brief moment, the trailer felt less like a prison and more like a place where 2 tired souls had found a way to survive. Morning arrived without ceremony. Gray sky, gray snow, gray light pushing through windows that had not been washed in months. The trailer smelled of propane and the ghost of last night's canned soup. Callum swung his legs off the cot and sat on the edge, both hands wrapped around his left knee, waiting for the joint to accept the idea of bearing weight again. It took a full minute. It always took a full minute. Some mornings it took longer, and those were the mornings when the war felt closest, when his body reminded him that it had already given everything it had and was now running on whatever was left. He stepped outside, and the cold hit him like a wall sharp and immediate, finding every gap in his jacket, every seam in his boots. He stood on the metal step, squinting at the emptiness that surrounded him. Miles of rangeland rolling toward a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. Miles of fence line and frozen earth and sky so wide it made his problems feel tiny and enormous at the same time, the kind of landscape that could make a man feel free or make him feel erased depending on the day. Today, it felt like erasure. Shadow jumped down beside him, landing carefully on 3 legs before settling his weight onto the 4th, and began his morning routine. Nose to the ground in quick, efficient arcs, checking the perimeter the way he had been trained in another life in a place where the things hiding in the dust could kill you. When satisfied, he circled back and nudged Callum's hand. A question asked in fur and breath. "You okay?" "I'm all right," Callum said. Shadow's brown eyes looked up at him with an expression that said he did not believe a word of it. But the dog accepted the lie the way he accepted it every morning and fell into step beside Callum as they walked to the truck. No leash. There had never been a leash. In the field, Shadow responded to hand signals across distances that would have swallowed a shout. Out here, he simply stayed close, because he chose to. The truck started on the third try, coughing to life like an old man clearing his throat. They drove into town. Callum asked about work at 2 ranches and was turned away from both. He bought a half bag of dog food with his last $10 and came home to find a yellow notice taped to the trailer door. He stood in the cold and read it with fingers going numb. Delinquent property payments. 1 more month before the county took the land his trailer sat on. He read the words 3 times, as if repetition might soften them, might rearrange the letters into something less final. But the words held their shape. They always did. Notices like this did not negotiate. They simply informed you politely and officially that the ground beneath your feet was no longer yours to stand on. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. There was nothing else to do with a piece of paper that told you your life was getting smaller. You could not argue with it. You could not fight it. You could only fold it up and carry it like one more weight in a coat already too heavy for your shoulders. Inside, he warmed a can of soup and poured the last kibble into Shadow's bowl. The dog ate slowly, pausing between bites to look up and check if Callum was eating too. He was not. But the dog ate first. Shadow always ate first. That was the one rule Callum never broke. As long as Shadow was fed, the world had not completely come apart. As long as the dog was cared for, there was still one thing in Callum's life he had not failed at. Night fell fast, the way Wyoming nights do when winter locks the doors. The sky dropped from gray to black before Callum finished washing his bowl. He sat on the cot staring through the small window, at nothing. The wind shoved the trailer. A shadow moved in the yard, just a tree branch, but his chest clenched anyway. Shadow stood beside him, tail rigid, eyes on the same window, just present, just ready. "You see it too, huh?" Callum said quietly. The world outside was too big, too cold, too full of things he could not fight anymore. And the world inside this trailer was too small to hold everything he carried. He lay down slowly. Shadow settled warm along his ribs. Callum placed one hand on the dog's side and felt the slow rise and fall, the rhythm that kept him tethered. "Just one peaceful night," he whispered. "That's all I need. Just one." Peace did not come. Only Shadow's heartbeat beneath his hand, steady and faithful beyond any promise a human being had ever kept. And somewhere far away, already stamped and sealed, a letter was making its way toward him. A letter carrying a brass key and a dead man's confession. One letter that would change both their lives forever. Morning came cold and sharp, the kind of dawn that makes the world feel brittle. Callum stood outside with Shadow at his heel, watching their breath rise in twin columns of steam. He did not expect the sound of tires on the dirt road. Nobody came out here. Nobody had reason to. Shadow froze mid-step, head snapping up, ears locked forward. Full alert. Something approaching. A small postal truck crawled toward them, engine struggling against the cold. The driver leaned out. Callum Brecker. "Got a certified letter. Need a signature." The envelope was heavy, thick paper, embossed lettering, a gold seal pressed into the flap. This was not a bill. This was something else entirely. Shadow pressed his nose against the envelope and sniffed hard twice. then pulled back with something in his eyes Callum had never seen before. Not warning. Something closer to recognition, as if the scent on that paper had unlocked a room in the dog's memory. The return address read, Harrington and Cole Attorneys at Law, Denver, Colorado. Inside the trailer, he set the envelope on the kitchen table and sat across from it as though it were another person in the room. Shadow took position at his feet, patient as stone. For a long time, Callum just stared. He had learned the hard way that unexpected letters meant trouble. Overdue balances, government notices, bad news dressed in official ink. But this envelope was different. Heavy paper, gold seal, his name spelled correctly without the misspellings he had grown used to. He tore it open. A key slid out first. Large brass, old-fashioned, with an intricate pattern etched into the head. It clattered across the table, and Shadow was instantly up-nose pressed against the metal tail, twitching nostrils flaring. Whatever he found in that scent, something electric passed across his face, something that looked almost like memory. Easy, boy. What's got into you? Shadow sat back but kept his eyes locked on the key. He was not letting it go. Callum unfolded the letter. Dear Mr. Brecker, we regret to inform you of the passing of Henry Ashford. As per his final will and testament, you have been identified as the sole surviving blood relative and are hereby named the sole heir to the Ashford estate located in Pine Ridge, Colorado. The property includes the main residence surrounding acreage and all contents therein. Your presence is required to finalize the transfer. Sincerely, Attorney Samuel Harrington. 3 times he read it. The words stayed the same but refused to make sense. Henry Ashford. He had never heard the name. His mother's family had been a locked room his entire life. She came from somewhere she refused to name, loved fiercely, kept her silence like a religion, and died without opening that door. When Callum asked as a boy, she would look away with something close to pain in her eyes and say, Some doors stay closed for a reason, baby. Trust me on that. He had trusted her, and now she was gone, and a brass key sat on his table like an answer to a question she had forbidden him to ask. Shadow pawed at the key gently, then looked up with a quiet whine. You know something I don't, Callum murmured. Don't you? The dog tilted his head, then turned toward the window, toward the distance, toward something he could not see but seemed to sense. Hope. That was the word for what stirred in Callum's chest, thin as frost on glass, fragile enough to shatter if he held it wrong, but unmistakably alive. For the first time in longer than he could remember, something inside him was reaching upward instead of sinking down. He looked at Shadow. Looks like we're going to Colorado. Shadow's ears shot forward. He let out one sharp bark that echoed through the trailer and across the frozen plains outside. Clear and strong and certain. It was the most decisive sound either of them had made in months. They left before noon. Callum packed what he owned into the truck bed. A worn duffel, a canteen, dog food, the envelope with the letter and the key. It all fit in a space no bigger than a footlocker. A man's entire life reduced to what could be carried in one trip. Shadow hopped into the passenger seat with a soft grunt and settled in chin on the doorframe near the cracked window, watching the trailer grow smaller in the side mirror, as if memorizing it, as if he understood they were not coming back. The trailer shrank in the rear view. Sagging roof, patched windows, peeling paint the color of surrender. Callum glanced back once more, and then forced his eyes forward. That place had been its own battlefield. Sleepless nights, mornings when the act of standing up felt like the hardest mission he had ever been assigned. But leaving stirred relief and fear in equal measure, tangled together like frayed rope, because walking away from a known hell still meant walking towards something unknown. And unknown had never been kind to Callum Brecker. Highway miles unspooled in long, quiet stretches. Snowfields gave way to forested hills, then to foothills rising like the hunched shoulders of sleeping giants. Shadow kept watch, turning occasionally to study Callum, checking for signs. The tight jaw, the white knuckles, the breath held one beat too long. 3 hours in a truck in the opposite lane backfired. The sound split the air like a rifle crack. Callum flinched so hard his body locked. Shoulders up, vision narrowing to a bright burning point. For 2 seconds, the highway vanished, and he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with dust and heat and the screaming of metal. Shadow moved before the second heartbeat, head on Callum's forearm, weight pressing down, warm and deliberate. 70 pounds of certainty anchoring him to the seat. Callum inhaled, held it, released through his teeth. "I'm okay," he whispered. He was not. But the weight of the dog kept his hands on the wheel, and that was enough. The highway narrowed into the mountains. Pines rose tall on both sides, heavy with snow. Fog slid between trunks like slow smoke. GPS lost signal. Cell bars vanished. The world outside became watchful, the kind of silence that has weight behind it. Shadow leaned forward, nose twitching, ears rotating. A low, uncertain whine built in his throat. "What is it, boy?" A rusted sign clung to a leaning post, barely legible beneath decades of weather. Private road, no entry. Ashford land. Shadow's growl was soft. Not aggression, acknowledgement. His body stiffened as if they had crossed a threshold, and the land on this side was different. The gravel road tunneled through overhanging branches, dark and narrow and endlessly winding. Headlights caught snowflakes and animal tracks and the glint of ice on stone. Every yard deeper felt heavier, not dangerous, but deliberate, as though the mountain was deciding whether to let them pass. Then the trees fell away. And the Ashford estate rose from the mountainside. It was enormous. Stone walls 3 stories high, darkened by decades of weather, windows towering and dark. Iron railings wrapped around balconies no one had stood on in 15 years. A broad stone staircase led to carved double doors beneath an intricate family crest, half buried in snow that no hand had cleared. The setting sun threw amber light across the face of the mansion, and in that glow, the stone seemed to breathe, as if the house had been holding 15 years of silence, and was now beginning to exhale. Callum parked the truck and stepped out slowly. The air smelled of pine frost and something faintly metallic that stirred a memory he could not place. Shadow landed beside him, careful on his bad leg, and immediately went to work, nose sweeping in disciplined arcs, tail low, ears forward, reading the property the way a soldier reads terrain. Callum stared up at the estate and felt the full weight of his own smallness. "Henry Ashford," he murmured to the cold air. "Who the hell were you, and why did you leave this to me?" Shadow trotted ahead, then stopped and turned back, waiting. The same posture from the field, the same patience. "I am not going in without you, and you are not staying out here alone." Callum pulled the brass key from his jacket. It felt warm against his cold fingers, warmer than metal should feel. He climbed the stone steps, each one a small war with his left knee, and stood before the double doors. He inserted the key and turned it. A deep, mechanical click echoed through the wood and into the space beyond. The ground vibrated faintly beneath his boots. The doors opened inward, smooth and slow, not pushed by wind, not forced by his hand. As if the house had been waiting for exactly this key and exactly this man. Shadow entered first, nose to marble, tail raised, every sense working. Callum followed, and the temperature changed around him like stepping through a curtain. Cold, still air heavy with dust and old wood, and that metallic scent stronger here, as if it lived in the walls. The foyer was vast. Carved beams arched high above, darkened with age. A wide staircase curved upward each step, draped in faded red. Dust floated in thin shafts of light from frosted windows. Portraits lined both walls, gilded frames holding stern faces that stared out, expecting to be remembered. Shadow moved through the hall with the quiet authority of a dog who had once worked rooms far more dangerous. His presence made the enormous space feel survivable. Without him, the mansion would have been too much, too large, too empty, too full of the particular silence that gathers in places where someone used to live and no longer does. The front doors settled shut behind them with a long sigh of wood and iron. Callum spun, hand-reaching for a weapon he had not carried in years. No one there. Just the doors finding their rest. Not creepy at all, he muttered. Shadow let out a quiet chuff that sounded like agreement, and something like a smile ghosted across Callum's face. They moved through the east wing. Room after room unfolded, each layered with evidence of a brilliant solitary life. Books stacked everywhere, blueprints tacked to corkboards, tools left Midas under dust, thick as velvet. The smell of old leather and pine oil and cold stone, and the particular loneliness of a house where one man worked for decades without anyone to share a meal. Then Shadow stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Entire body, rigid ears, locked weight shifting forward, staring at a doorway half blocked by a fallen curtain. Callum pushed the fabric aside. A library, 2 stories tall. Shelves reaching the ceiling on every wall filled with hundreds of books so dusty they seemed to be sleeping beneath years of neglect. Tall windows let in the last of the dying light. The smell of paper and old binding glue hung in the still air like incense. Shadow was not interested in the books. He walked straight to the stone fireplace and scratched gently at the base. Then turned and looked at Callum with eyes that said, "This is what I brought you here for." Callum knelt his knee protesting, ran his fingers along the stone until he found it. One block at a different angle, fractionally loose. He worked at free stone, grinding against stone. Behind it, a hollow space. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, a thick leather notebook. Beneath it, rolled blueprints tied with string. He lifted the notebook. Cracked leather. Preserved pages. Dense handwriting on every sheet. Diagrams drawn with the precision of an architect. Calculations that filled entire margins. Notes crowded between lines, sometimes circling back on themselves, as though the man writing them could not stop thinking long enough to finish a single sentence before the next idea arrived. Page after page of a man's life work, meticulous and obsessive and painfully unfinished. The last third of the notebook was blank, Clean pages waiting for words that never came, waiting for hands that had grown too weak to hold the pen. The front page, Eden Project. Plans for a Community Energy Center, Pine Ridge, Colorado, by Henry Ashford. He turned to the back. The handwriting changed, shakier, letters wandering, ink bleeding where the hand trembled. A letter, addressed to Callum, never sent. Henry was his grandfather, his mother's father. The man behind the locked door she had refused to open for as long as Callum could remember. She had left the family decades ago, wanting a life far from whatever Henry had built in these mountains. She wanted ordinary. She wanted safe. She wanted her son to grow up without the weight of a name that carried too much history and too many secrets. Henry respected her choice. He stayed away. He never called. He never visited. He never sent a birthday card or a Christmas letter or any of the small signals that tell a child someone out there is thinking of them. But he never stopped watching. He tracked Callum from a distance over the years. Not his daily life, his character, the way he treated his fellow soldiers, the way he cared for Shadow even when he could not care for himself, the way he carried pain without letting it make him cruel. And then Henry did the thing that changed everything. He used old military connections to place Callum in the Special Reconnaissance Unit, his father's unit. Henry believed it was the safest place for his grandson, the best men, the strongest bonds. He believed he was building a wall of protection around a young man he loved but could never touch. He was wrong. The last mission, the ambush that came out of nowhere, the explosion that destroyed Callum's knee, that drove shrapnel into Shadow's shoulder, that killed men whose names Callum still whispered in his nightmares. That mission was built on intelligence that Henry Ashford had helped provide to military command. He did not pull the trigger. He did not give the order. But he built the road that led his own grandson into the fire. The final lines of the letter shook in Callum's hands. I tried to protect you from a distance. Instead, I sent you into the fire. This project is the only apology I know how to give. Finish it. Not for me. I do not deserve that. Finish it for the town that has nothing left. Finish it for Dot, who gave me 40 years and got silence in return. And if you cannot forgive me, at least let something good grow from what I broke. Callum set the notebook on the floor. His hands were trembling, but not the PTSD kind of trembling. This was something deeper, something structural, a wall he had spent decades building, cracking from the inside out. He stood, walked out of the library without a word. Shadow followed, pressing close, nudging his hand. But Callum was somewhere no dog could reach. Not yet. He walked through the dark corridor, past the portraits, past the dust and silence, and out onto the front steps of the Ashford estate. The cold hit him. The mountains stood around him, vast and uncaring. He breathed, but the air tasted thin and wrong. Behind him, soft footsteps on stone. Old footsteps, careful footsteps. He turned. A woman stood in the doorway, small and thin, with silver hair pulled back from a face that carried years of solitude in every line. Her eyes were wet, but her spine was straight. She held a gray knitted shawl against her chest, clutched tight, worn soft by years of holding. She looked at Callum the way you look at someone you have been waiting 15 years to see. You look just like your mother, she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, and the crack held 15 years of waiting inside it. Dorothy Ashford, Dot Henry's wife, 67 years old. The woman who stayed behind when everyone else left. who had lived alone in a small cabin at the edge of this property for a decade and a half, keeping a promise to a dead man because she did not know any other way to love him except to keep showing up. Shadow moved before Callum could find a single word. The dog walked straight to Dot, lowered his head, and sat at her feet with a gentleness that seemed too large for an animal. Not trained behavior, something deeper, something that lived in the space between instinct and grace. Dot looked down at the dog. Her thin hand, trembling with age and grief, reached out slowly, hesitantly, the way you reach for something precious that you are afraid will disappear the moment you touch it. Her fingers came to rest on Shadow's broad head, settling into the fur between his ears. "I haven't touched a dog since Henry passed," she whispered. "He had one just like you. Same eyes, same way of sitting too close, like they know you need them before you know it yourself." Shadow leaned into her palm. Dot closed her eyes. A single tear traced the deep lines of her face, following the path carved by all the tears that came before it. Callum stood on the steps with the letter burning in his memory and the cold burning in his knee and something he could not name burning in the back of his throat. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to turn around, walk down those steps, get in the truck, and drive back to his trailer and his familiar pain. He wanted to tear that notebook apart and let the wind take every page. But the woman in the doorway was crying, and his dog was sitting at her feet, looking up at Callum with an expression that said plainly and without negotiation, "This is someone who needs us to stay." "You knew," Callum said. His voice came out rough and low. "About the letter, about what he did." Dot opened her eyes, shook her head slowly, and the grief in her face shifted, making room for shock. "I didn't know, not until today." She glanced toward the library behind her. "I found the pages on the floor. I read them." Her voice fell to almost nothing. 40 years married, and he never told me." Silence held the space between them. Two people betrayed by the same man. Two people who had loved Henry Ashford without knowing the full cost of that love. The wind moved through the pines. Shadow stayed at Dot's feet, warm and patient and completely still. Then Dot spoke again, and her words carried the weight of every winter she had spent alone on this mountain. Every morning she had woken in that cabin and looked at the dark windows of the empty mansion and wondered if anyone would ever come. "The town is dying, Callum. Pine Ridge has lost its store, lost its school, lost its young people to cities that offered more than silence. Henry believed this project could bring it back. He worked on it until his hands could not hold a pen anymore." She paused, and the pause had gravity. "There is a man named Garrett Webb, a developer. He has been buying the land around us for years, piece by piece, patient as winter. He wants this property, and the county has given us 30 days to prove this land is being used for something real, or they will auction it off." Callum looked at the mansion behind her. Cracked stone, dark windows, 15 years of neglect pressing down on every beam and rafter. A project designed by a dead man who had destroyed his life. 30 days. And a town full of strangers he had no reason to care about. "I fix fences for a living," he said. "I'm not an engineer. I'm not a builder." Dot studied him for a long moment. The way she looked at him was not pity, and it was not expectation. It was something more patient than either. "If you do this," she said, and her voice was steady, now clear as the cold air between them, "you will not just pull this house out of the dark. you will pull this whole town out of its long sleep." Shadow stood and moved to the space between them, looking from Dot's face to Callum's and back again, as if drawing an invisible line between two people who did not yet know they needed each other. Callum looked at the notebook visible through the open door, looked at Shadow, looked at the old woman holding a shawl that still carried the scent of a man who had been dead for 15 years. He did not say yes, but he did not say no. That night he sat alone in the great hall of the Ashford estate. The notebook lay open on his lap under the amber glow of an old oil lamp he had found in the kitchen, its flame steady and small, throwing a circle of gold across the stone floor. Shadow lay beside him, chin resting on Callum's boot eyes open, watching. Not sleeping, not relaxing. Simply present the way he had been present through every dark night in the trailer, every flashback, every morning when Callum was not sure he could stand. The mansion creaked and settled around them old wood, adjusting to the warmth of a fire and the weight of a living man walking its floors for the first time in 15 years. The fire Callum had built in the hall fireplace popped and threw warm light across the floor, pushing shadows into far corners. The smell of wood smoke mixed with dust and old stone. And for a moment, just a moment, the great hall felt less like a museum and more like a place where someone might actually sit and think and breathe. He turned the pages slowly. Between the technical drawings and energy calculations, small notes filled the margins. Not about the project, about Callum, his first deployment date, his commendation for bravery, the day he adopted Shadow from the military working dog program. Small, precise facts gathered from a distance over years by a man who loved someone he was never allowed to approach. Callum closed the notebook and pressed his palm flat against the leather cover. He sat very still for a long time. The anger was there deep and hot, coiled around his spine like something alive. But underneath it, or maybe beside it, was something else. Something that felt dangerously close to understanding, to grief. To the terrible recognition that people who love you can also be the ones who hurt you the most, and that both of those things can be completely, simultaneously true. Shadow sighed beside him, a long, slow breath that fogged in the cold air. His tail tapped once against the stone floor. Once. As if to say, "I am still here. Whatever you decide, I am still here." Outside, the mountain wind moved through the tall pines, carrying the scent of snow and stone, and the years that had passed since anyone last sat in this chair beside this fire, in this house, full of secrets and silence. And for the first time in 15 years, the Ashford estate was not completely quiet. A lamp was burning. A fire was crackling. A man was sitting with a dead man's words in his lap and a living dog at his feet. And whether Callum Brecker would stay or walk away by morning, whether he would build a dead man's dream or let it rot beneath the snow, whether he could forgive the grandfather who sent him into the fire or carry that rage until it ate him hollow, all of that waited in the darkness beyond the circle of lamplight. Patient as the mountains, heavy as the snow gathering on the roof above him, and as uncertain as the next breath of a man who had forgotten long ago how to trust that morning would bring anything worth waking for. The first morning Callum spent working in the Ashford estate began with silence and ended with sawdust. He woke on the leather sofa in the great hall, stiff and cold. with Shadow curled against his thigh and the oil lamp burned down to a faint orange glow. Gray light pressed through the tall windows. The fire had died sometime in the night, leaving a thin ribbon of smoke curling upward from the ash. The mansion smelled of cold stone and old timber and the particular stillness that settles into a place when it has been holding its breath for too long. Callum sat up slowly, both hands around his left knee, waiting for the joint to accept the morning. Shadow lifted his head ears, rotating, reading the silence of the house the way he once read the silence of desert outposts before dawn patrols. When he was satisfied that nothing had changed, he stretched, shook his coat, and padded to the front door. He looked back at Callum and waited. "All right," Callum murmured. "I hear you." He opened the door. The mountain air hit him clean and sharp tasting of pine needles and frost and the faint metallic edge that seemed to live in the bones of this property. Shadow trotted out, did his sweep of the front grounds, nose to the frozen earth, then circled back and sat on the top step, watching, waiting, as if asking what happens now. Callum stood beside the dog and looked out at the valley below. Pine Ridge sat in the distance, a scattering of rooftops and a single church steeple, barely visible through the morning haze. A town that had once been something and was now becoming nothing, one closed storefront at a time. He went back inside, opened the notebook to the first technical page, read it slowly, understanding maybe a third of what was written there. Then he rolled up his sleeves, found the workshop Henry had built in the east wing, and started clearing the dust off the workbenches. He did not know what he was building yet. He did not know if he could build anything at all. But his hands needed to move, and the silence needed to be broken, and those two things together were enough to start. Shadow followed him into the workshop and took a position near the door, watching the hallway in both directions. On duty again. It had been a long time since either of them had a post to guard. By noon, Callum had cleared the main workbench, sorted through a shelf of tools, and read another 30 pages of the notebook. His understanding grew slowly, the way a trail becomes visible when you walk it enough times. Henry's Eden project was ambitious, but not impossible. A community energy system, solar and wind, and a small prototype generator that could power the town's essential buildings. The designs were thorough. The calculations were precise. What was missing was the labor, the materials, and the time that Henry's failing body had stolen from him. Callum was measuring a section of copper tubing against a diagram when he heard tires on gravel. Shadow was at the window before Callum reached the door. The dog's posture shifted to alert ears forward, but his tail held neutral. Not a threat. A visitor. An old Ford truck rust eating the wheel wells pulled up and parked beside Callum's pickup. The door opened and a man stepped out who looked like he had been built from the same materials as the mountains around him. Tall and broad, with a white beard that covered most of his jaw and hands the size of dinner plates. He wore a canvas jacket so old it had taken on the color of the earth itself, and he carried a wooden toolbox that had clearly seen more decades of work than most men see in a lifetime. He walked toward the front steps without hurry, glanced at Shadow standing in the doorway, and nodded at the dog with the casual respect of someone who understood animals. "You the one fixing up the Ashford place," he called out. Callum stepped onto the porch. "Trying to." The man set his toolbox down on the bottom step. "Name's Bert Henley. I'm a carpenter. Retired mostly, but my wife says I'm harder to live with when I sit still." He looked up at the mansion, squinting. "Heard in town that old Henry's grandson showed up. Figured you could use a hand before this place falls on your head. Callum studied him. I can't pay you. Bert waved that off like swatting a fly. I didn't ask for pay. I asked if you need help. Those are two different things. Shadow stepped forward and sniffed Bert's outstretched hand. The dog's tail moved once, then twice. Approval. Bert scratched behind Shadow's ear with a gentleness that seemed unlikely for hands that large. Good dog, Bert said. Smart eyes. He military. Retired K9, Callum said. Figured. Got that look. Same look you got. Bert picked up his toolbox and walked past Callum into the house without waiting for an invitation. He stopped in the foyer, looked up at the carved beams, whistled low, and said, Well, this is going to take more than a weekend. By the end of that first day, Bert had reinforced 2 sagging door frames, identified a dozen structural concerns, and taped a hand-drawn sign to the workshop door that read, Dog is fine. Boss needs therapy. Callum stared at the sign. Something twitched at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but closer to one than anything had gotten in a very long time. Shadow tilted his head at the sign, then looked at Callum as if to say he is not wrong. The second visitor came the next morning. Callum was on the roof inspecting the condition of the solar panel mounts Henry had installed years ago when he saw a figure walking up the gravel road on foot. No car, no truck. Just a man in a dark coat moving with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who was in no hurry because hurry had been burned out of him a long time ago. Shadow watched from the front porch body, still nose working. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply watched, and when the man reached the front steps, Shadow did something Callum had rarely seen him do with a stranger. He walked forward, sat down directly in front of the man, and stayed. Not blocking, not guarding. Just sitting. Close. As if he had recognized something in this person that required his presence. The man looked down at Shadow for a long moment. His face was weathered and lined with deep-set eyes that held the kind of quiet that comes from having seen too much and said too little about it. He was maybe 65 with close-cropped gray hair and a slight stoop in his shoulders that spoke of years carrying something heavier than any pack. Silas Wardell, he said, looking up at Callum on the roof. His voice was low, almost flat, stripped of everything except the words themselves. I heard you need help. I might, Callum said carefully. Where do you need me? No small talk. No questions about the project. No curiosity about the mansion or the inheritance or any of the things that would have interested most people. Just a man offering his hands and asking where to put them. Callum climbed down from the roof. Can you lift? I can lift. Silas walked into the workshop, took off his coat, and began carrying lumber without another word. Shadow followed him inside and took up a position beside him, sitting closer to Silas than he sat to most people, watching the man work with an attentiveness that Callum recognized. It was the same attention Shadow gave to Callum on the bad nights. The nights when the darkness pressed in too close. Shadow had identified a wound in this man. Callum could see it too. But neither of them said a word about it. Some things you do not name out loud. You just stand near them and wait. By the third day, the workshop had been cleared, the main workbench organized with Henry's tools and diagrams, and the first section of the prototype energy system had been assembled according to the notebook's specifications. Callum was beginning to understand the design in a way that went beyond reading. His hands were learning the language his eyes had only started to translate. That afternoon, a woman arrived. She drove a dark green truck with a university parking sticker on the bumper and stepped out carrying a leather bag heavy with documents. She was perhaps 45, with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, and the steady, assessing eyes of someone who solved problems for a living rather than worrying about them. She walked up to the workshop where Callum and Bert were arguing about the angle of a support beam. She looked at the beam, looked at the diagram pinned to the wall, and said, "You're both wrong. It needs to be offset by 12 degrees to account for the wind load at this elevation." Callum turned. "And you are Linnea Foss. I teach energy engineering at the State College in Fort Collins. I read about Henry Ashford's work years ago in a journal he self-published. Brilliant man. Terrible at asking for help." She set her bag on the workbench. "I drove up when I heard someone was finally trying to finish what he started." She unrolled one of Henry's blueprints and ran her finger along a series of calculations. "Your grandfather was ahead of his time by 20 years, she said, without looking up. "This design is elegant, efficient, and entirely buildable with the materials available in this region." She paused, then added, "It would have changed this town." "Would have?" Callum asked. Linnea looked at him. "Would have. Will. Depends on whether you finish it." She was not warm. She was not cold. She was precise the way a good tool is precise. She said what she meant and meant what she said, and there was a kind of comfort. In that, the comfort of knowing exactly where you stood with someone without having to guess. Bert leaned over to Callum and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I like her. She's terrifying." Linnea did not smile, but something shifted in her expression that suggested she had heard worse and considered it a compliment. Shadow approached Linnea that evening while she was reviewing calculations at the kitchen table. He sat beside her chair and rested his chin on her knee. Linnea looked down at the dog surprised, then placed her hand on his head without a word. They stayed like that for a long time, the engineer and the dog sharing a silence that neither seemed to need filled. The days began to find a rhythm. Bert arrived at 7 each morning, toolbox in hand, bad jokes loaded. Silas appeared shortly after, always on foot, always quiet, always heading straight for whatever task needed muscle. Linnea came 3 days a week from Fort Collins, spending hours with the blueprints translating Henry's vision into actionable steps that Callum and Bert could follow. And through it all, Shadow moved between them, nudging Bert's hand when the old man paused for breath, sitting beside Silas during the long silences, following Linnea from room to room as she measured and calculated, and always, always returning to Callum, pressing against his leg when the noise grew too much, resting his chin on Callum's boot when the work stopped and the quiet crept back in. It was on the 7th day, a Tuesday bright with mountain sun, that the wood fell. Callum and Bert were clearing the old storage room adjacent to the workshop. A stack of lumber that Henry had stored years ago, dried and warped with time, was leaning against the far wall. Callum reached for a crossbeam to shift it, and the entire stack groaned and slid. A board at the top broke free and fell fast, its splintered edge catching Shadow across the top of his left shoulder. The dog yelped, a sharp, sudden sound that Callum had not heard since Afghanistan. Shadow stumbled sideways, shook himself, and when Callum looked, there was blood. Not much. A thin red line running through the fur on his shoulder, bright against the black and tan. But it did not matter that it was small. Callum dropped everything. His face went white. His hands began to shake. He was on his knees beside Shadow in a second, fingers pressing into the fur around the wound, voice cracking. No, 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 no. Let me see. Let me see it. Shadow stood still patient, tail low, but not tucked. He licked Callum's wrist once. I am okay. But Callum could not hear it. His vision had narrowed the way it did during episodes, the edges going dark, the center sharpening to a single point of focus. All he could see was blood. All he could feel was the memory of other blood on other fur in another place, where the sand was red and the air smelled like burning metal. Bert stepped forward carefully. Easy, son. Easy. It's a scratch. He's fine. Callum did not hear him. He was already lifting Shadow, 70 pounds of dog gathered against his chest, carrying him toward the door. His bad knee screamed, but he did not feel it. He did not feel anything except the weight of the dog and the pounding in his chest and the voice in his head that said, "You are losing him. You are losing him. You are losing everything again." Linnea met him at the door. She had heard the yelp from the kitchen. She looked at the wound, looked at Callum's face, and understood immediately what was happening. "Put him down," she said calmly. "Callum, put him on the bench. I have a first aid kit." Her voice was steady, not gentle in the way that pity is gentle, but firm in the way that competence is firm. It reached through the fog the same way Shadow's breathing reached through the flashbacks. Callum set Shadow on the workbench. His hands were shaking badly. Linnea cleaned the wound with antiseptic and pressed a gauze pad against it. The cut was shallow, 2 inches long. It would heal without stitches. "He is fine," Linnea said, looking Callum directly in the eyes. "Do you hear me? He is fine. He's going to be completely fine." Callum exhaled, a long, broken breath that came from somewhere deeper than his lungs. His hands were still trembling. He placed them flat on the bench and pressed down, trying to stop the shaking by force. Linnea watched him for a moment, then said quietly, "What are you really trying to fix here? Callum, the house, or yourself?" He did not answer. He could not answer, because the truth was a door he was not ready to open, and both of them knew it. Shadow, wound, cleaned, and bandaged, jumped carefully off the bench. He walked to Callum, circled him once the way he used to circle a position before settling in the field, and then sat down with his bandaged shoulder resting gently against Callum's shin, the wound touching the man's leg, as if to say, "This scratch is nothing. I have survived worse for you, and I would do it again without thinking." His eyes held no pain and no reproach, only patience, only the quiet certainty that had carried them both through years of dark nights and hard mornings. Callum placed his hand on Shadow's head. He did not count his breaths this time. He did not need to. His fingers knew the fur. His palm knew the warmth. His body remembered the rhythm without being told, the way a musician remembers a song he has played 1,000 times. The shaking slowed on its own, not because the dog commanded it, because somewhere beneath the fear and the grief and the years of carrying too much alone, Callum's body had learned to trust the weight of a dog's head beneath his hand. That evening, something worse. Callum was sitting on the back porch of the mansion looking out at the trees when the wind picked up a loose piece of sheet metal somewhere on the property and slammed it against stone. The sound was sharp and sudden and exactly the wrong frequency. It cut through his eardrums and went straight to the place in his brain where the war still lived. He was gone before he could stop it. The porch disappeared. The trees disappeared. The mountains vanished. There was only sand, only heat, Only the deafening percussion of metal against metal that meant incoming, that meant get down, that meant someone is about to die. He fell off the chair. His back hit the wooden planks of the porch. His hands came up to cover his head fingers, lacing behind his skull body, curled tight knees drawn to his chest. He could hear breathing fast and ragged and broken. It took him several seconds to realize it was his own. The world had split into one half, the cold mountain porch, where his body lay the other half, a burning road in a country he had promised himself he would never go back to, but kept returning to every time the wrong sound found his ears. Shadow was there. He was always there, not barking, not whining, not panicking. He did not try to lick Callum's face or paw at his hands, or do any of the things that well-meaning but untrained dogs do when their owners are in distress. Instead, he did exactly what he had been trained to do. He lay down beside Callum on the porch, pressed his entire body against the man's side, and matched his breathing to a slow, deliberate rhythm. Then he rested his head on Callum's chest, directly over his heart, and held it there, steady, patient, as if teaching Callum how to breathe all over again, as if saying, match me, I will breathe for both of us, until you remember how. Callum's hands found the dog's fur. His fingers sank into the warm coat and held on, the way a drowning man holds the only solid thing in the water. He could feel Shadow's ribs expanding and contracting beneath his palms. In, out, in, out. Each breath a small act of rescue. Each exhale a rope thrown into dark water. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe longer. Time does not move normally during these episodes. It stretches and compresses and loses its shape the way metal warps under heat. But slowly, like dawn arriving after the longest night in the world, reality came back. The porch, the trees, the mountains standing where they had always stood patient and unmoved. The cold evening air on his face, the sound of wind through pine branches that was just wind through pine branches and nothing else, nothing more, nothing worse. I'm here, Callum whispered, his voice raw. I'm here. Shadow lifted his head and looked at him. Then he licked Callum's cheek once, gently, and rested his head back on Callum's chest. Callum lay on the porch for a long time after the episode passed, one hand on Shadow's back, staring at the sky as the first stars appeared. His body ached. His mind was exhausted, but he was here. He was present. And the dog had brought him back the way the dog always brought him back. He did not know that Silas was standing at the corner of the porch, half hidden in shadow. Had been standing there for the entire episode, had watched the whole thing unfold without speaking, without moving, without making a sound. Silas did not say anything that night. He simply turned and walked back into the house, but something in his posture had changed, something in the set of his shoulders, as if watching Callum's war had opened a door to his own. It was 3 days later, on a cold evening when the work had stopped and the others had gone, that Silas finally spoke. They were sitting on the back porch, Callum with a cup of cold coffee, Silas with nothing. Shadow lay between them, his chin on his front paws' ears, swiveling at the sounds of the night forest. The sky was enormous above them, clear and black and thick with stars. Silas stared at the horizon for a long time. His hands rested on his knees, still and heavy, the hands of a man who had spent his whole life working and had finally run out of things to build. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, like gravel being turned by hand. My son used to call the engine sound a dragon. Callum did not turn, did not react. He just listened because listening was the only honest thing he could offer a man who was about to open a door he had kept locked for years. He was 9 years old. Smart kid. Smarter than me by a long stretch. Loved machines. Loved taking things apart and putting them back together. Used to sit on my lap while I worked on the truck and make roaring sounds every time I revved the motor. He called it waking the dragon. A pause so long the wind filled it and the stars moved above them. Lightning took him. Summer storm. Just a regular afternoon storm, the kind that rolls through every July. He was standing under the oak tree in the backyard. I was inside, making lemonade. He asked for lemonade, and I went inside to make it for him. His voice cracked, just barely like a stone with a hairline fracture that had been holding together for years. I heard the crack, and I knew. Before I reached the door, before I saw, I knew. A man knows that sound when it takes something from him. He never unhears it. Silence, complete and heavy and sacred. Shadow slowly walked to Silas and placed his head on the man's knee. Silas looked down. His hand, rough and scarred, came to rest on Shadow's head. He did not cry. His eyes were wet, but the grief was too old for tears. It had passed through the stage of crying years ago and settled into something deeper, a permanent ache that lived in the marrow. Callum said nothing. He did not offer comfort or platitudes or the hollow phrases people use when they do not know what else to say. He simply sat there beside a man whose loss was different from his own, but whose weight was the same. Sometimes being present is the only honest thing you can do for someone who is grieving. Sometimes silence is the most respectful language two broken men can share. They sat until the stars shifted overhead and the cold drove them inside. Neither of them mentioned what had been said. Neither of them needed to. The next morning, a black SUV appeared on the gravel road. It moved slowly, deliberately, in the way expensive cars move when they want you to notice them. It stopped in front of the estate, and a man stepped out who looked like he had been polished for the occasion. Dark suit, shined shoes that were entirely wrong for the muddy mountain road. Hair combed with the kind of precision that costs money. He was perhaps 55, with a face that had learned to smile without warmth and eyes that calculated before they looked. Garrett Webb. Shadow stood at the top of the steps, and for the first and only time in the entire story, the dog growled at a human being, not the low rumble of uncertainty. A full, clear growl that came from the chest and filled the air between them. Hair rising along his spine. Teeth visible behind pulled lips. Webb stopped. He looked at the dog, then at Callum, who had stepped out onto the porch behind Shadow. "Mr. Brecker," Webb said. His voice was smooth, measured. The voice of a man who had negotiated deals worth millions and considered a growling dog a minor inconvenience. "I was hoping we could talk." "Then talk," Callum said. Webb glanced at the construction materials stacked along the porch, the sawdust on Callum's clothes, the notebook tucked under his arm. He took in every detail with the practiced efficiency of someone assessing the value of a piece of land by looking at what stood on it. "This property has been vacant for 15 years, Webb said. "I have been developing Pine Ridge steadily during that time, bringing investment, bringing infrastructure. This parcel is the last piece I need to complete a development that will bring real economic life back to this valley." "Is that what you call it?" Callum said. Webb reached into his jacket and produced a white envelope. He held it out. Inside that envelope is an offer. Generous. More than this land is appraised for. More than enough to set you up comfortably somewhere warm with a yard for the dog. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. You could be free of all of this. Callum did not take the envelope. Webb placed it on the porch railing. I know about the project. Webb continued, his voice dropping slightly. Henry's little science experiment. I also know something else. He paused, letting the silence do its work. I know about the letter. Callum's body went still. The attorneys shared certain details during the estate proceedings, Webb said. I know what Henry did. The military connections. The intelligence he provided. The mission that followed. Another pause precise as a surgeon's cut. The man who left you this house is the same man who sent you to that ambush. Your bad knee. Your dead friends. His gift to you. Webb tilted his head, studying Callum the way a man studies a cracked foundation. And you are building a monument to him. The words hit like shrapnel. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. Bert, standing in the workshop doorway, went still. Silas, carrying a board across the yard, stopped and looked at the ground. Linnea, visible through the kitchen window, set down her pen. Callum said nothing for a long time. Shadow's growl had faded, but the dog remained positioned between Callum and Webb, body tense, eyes locked. When Callum finally spoke, his voice was flat, drained of everything except honesty. He's not wrong. Then he turned and walked into the workshop, closed the door. Webb stood on the gravel for a moment, smile gone, replaced by something closer to satisfaction. He straightened his jacket, got back into his SUV, and drove away. The envelope stayed on the railing, white against the dark wood, clean and sharp as an accusation. Bert looked at Silas. Silas looked at Linnea. Linnea looked at the closed workshop door. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Shadow walked to the workshop door, lay down in front of it, and waited. The envelope sat on the kitchen table for 2 days. Callum did not touch it. He did not open it. But he looked at it every time he walked past, and every time he looked at it, something inside him unraveled a little more. He kept working. But the work felt hollow now. Every time he picked up one of Henry's tools, he saw the old man's hands. Every time he read a page of the notebook, he heard the words of the letter underneath. I sent you into the fire. He could not separate the gift from the wound, could not separate the man who dreamed of saving a town from the man who had destroyed his grandson's life. The darkest moment came on a Tuesday night. Callum sat alone in the workshop after everyone had gone home. The mansion was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes the thoughts louder. The notebook lay open on the bench in front of him, Henry's careful handwriting staring up like a face he could not look at and could not look away from. Beside it, the white envelope from Webb, still sealed, still sharp-edged, still carrying inside it the promise of an easier life. He looked at both of them for a long time. The notebook and the envelope. The dream and the escape. The past and the possibility of walking away from it. His knee ached. It always ached, but tonight it felt personal. As if the joint was reminding him where it came from, who was responsible, what had been lost the day it was shattered. He rubbed it absently, pressing his thumb into the scar tissue through his jeans, and the motion triggered a cascade of memories he did not want. The sound of the explosion. the heat of it. The moment when gravity disappeared and the ground was no longer beneath his feet. And then the pain. And then shadow dragging him through sand that was wet with something he could not name. Everything he had been reduced to this limping man in a cold workshop, reading a dead man's notes. It all led back to that moment. And that moment led back to Henry. He could feel the anger building. Not the hot, quick kind that flares and fades. The deep, slow kind that lives in the foundation of a person and shifts the weight of everything built on top of it. The kind of anger that makes you want to tear something down just to prove you still have the strength to do it. Then he reached for the notebook, picked it up, held it in both hands, felt the weight of it, the weight of Henry's dream. Henry's apology, Henry's betrayal, all bound together in cracked leather and aging paper. He pulled a lighter from the tool drawer, flicked it once. The flame appeared small and orange, dancing in the still air of the workshop. He held the notebook over it, close enough to feel the heat on his fingers, close enough to watch the edge of the leather begin to darken. Shadow barked. One bark. Sharp, urgent, pained, not a warning bark, not an alert bark, a bark that sounded like the word stop spoken in a language older than words. It filled the workshop and bounced off the stone walls and hung in the air like the ringing of a bell. Callum's hand jerked back. The lighter snapped shut. The notebook fell onto the bench, its edge singed but intact. He stared at Shadow. The dog was standing in the middle of the workshop body, rigid eyes wide, breathing hard. He looked frightened, not of the fire, of what Callum had been about to do, of what it would have meant. Callum set the lighter down. His hands were shaking. He sat for a long time in the silence that followed, staring at the singed edge of the leather, at the lighter, at the dog. Then he picked up his phone. Silas answered on the fourth ring. "I need you to tell Webb I'll take the money." Callum's voice was flat, dead. The voice of a man who had decided to stop fighting. Henry doesn't deserve a monument. He deserves to be forgotten. Silence on the other end. Long silence. The kind that has texture. Then Silas spoke, and his voice was the quietest Callum had ever heard it. Maybe he does deserve that. But Dot doesn't deserve it. This town doesn't deserve it. A breath. And that boy in Pine Ridge who can't sleep at night because his daddy came home from the war different, he doesn't deserve to be forgotten either. Another pause. Then the line that cut through everything. Quitting isn't rest, Callum. Quitting is exile. I will not let lightning take one more person. The phone went silent. Callum sat in the workshop staring at the dark screen, the singed notebook, the lighter, the white envelope. He stood, slowly, picked up his jacket, his keys, his phone. He walked through the dark hallway of the Ashford mansion toward the front door. His boots echoed on the marble floor, each step sounding final like a door closing behind him. He reached the front entrance, put his hand on the iron handle, and stopped, because Shadow was already there, not behind him, not beside him, in front of the door. Standing in the center of the frame square, shouldered ears, raised eyes fixed on Callum with an intensity that went beyond training, beyond instinct, beyond anything that could be explained by the bond between a man and his dog. He was not barking. He was not growling. He was not shaking or pacing or whining. He was simply standing there, still as carved stone, blocking the only way out. "Move," Callum said. Shadow did not move. Callum stepped to the left. Shadow shifted left. A single step, smooth and deliberate, filling the gap without aggression, without panic, with nothing but absolute certainty. Callum stepped right. Shadow mirrored him. Same speed, same calm, same complete, unwavering refusal to let his partner walk through that door and into the cold and the dark and the empty road that led away from this place and everyone in it. They stood like that for what felt like a very long time. Man and dog, face to face, in the dark entrance hall of a mansion that had been silent for 15 years and was only now learning how to hold sound again. The wind pressed against the windows outside. The old wood creaked in the walls around them. Somewhere far across the valley, an owl called into the empty air and received no answer. Callum's jaw tightened. His eyes burned. Something behind his ribs was pushing upward, pressing against the walls he had built, testing the seams he had welded shut years ago. His throat closed around it. Whatever it was, it had been locked down for so long, it had almost forgotten what it felt like to move. But it was moving now. Shadow had that effect on him. The dog had always had that effect. Standing there in the doorway, silent and sure, refusing to let Callum do the thing that would destroy him, refusing to move, even if Callum ordered it, because some orders are wrong. And the best soldiers, the ones with the deepest loyalty, know when to disobey. He went to his knees, slowly. The left one, grinding, protesting, but he barely felt it. His hands found Shadow's fur. His fingers sank in and held on. He leaned forward until his forehead rested against the dog's shoulder, against the broad, warm muscle that had carried them both through deserts and trailers and nights that seemed like they would never end. "I'm tired," he whispered. His voice broke, completely, like a dam that had held for years, and finally, quietly gave way. "I'm so tired." Shadow leaned into him, pressed his weight against Callum's chest. Then he licked Callum's hand. Once, slow, and again, slower. Callum stayed on his knees for a long time, long enough for the wind to change direction outside, long enough for the owl to stop calling, long enough for the darkness in the hallway to feel less like a threat and more like a blanket. When he finally stood, he did not go to the door. He walked to the kitchen table, picked up Webb's envelope, looked at it, felt its weight. Then he tore it in half, and tore the halves in half, and let the pieces fall onto the floor like snow. Shadow watched the paper settle onto the floor like leaves falling from a dead branch. Then he looked up at Callum and his tail moved. Once, twice, slow and deliberate, as if to say good. That is the right answer. That is the answer I was waiting for. Callum sat down at the table, put his head in his hands, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he cried. Not the silent, clenched kind of crying he had learned to do in the dark. Real crying. The kind that comes from the chest and shakes the shoulders and sounds like something being released rather than something being contained. Shadow lay at his feet, warm and still, and stayed with him through every breath of it. The next morning, Callum sent a text message to the group. 2 words. Keep going. Bert arrived first toolbox in hand. He looked at the torn pieces of Webb's envelope on the kitchen floor, said nothing, and pinned a new sign to the workshop door, Day 12, still standing. So was the dog. Silas appeared 20 minutes later. He walked in, looked at Callum, and gave a single nod. The kind of nod that says, "I heard you last night, and I am glad you stayed." Then he picked up a hammer and went to work. Linnea came that afternoon with new calculations and a thermos of coffee. She spread the blueprints across the workbench and said, "We have 18 days. Let's not waste them." And then slowly, the thing that Callum had not expected began to happen. People came, not just Bird and Silas and Linnea. Others, people from Pine Ridge who had heard through the invisible network of a small town where nothing stays secret for long that something was happening at the old Ashford place. A retired electrician named Walt showed up with a truck full of wiring and a quiet determination that suggested he had been waiting for a reason to use his hands again. A woman named Grace, who ran what was left of the general store, brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and stayed to help organize supplies, sorting screws and bolts, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years knowing exactly where everything in her store belonged. Two teenagers' brothers named Danny and Eli came because their grandfather had known Henry Ashford and had told them stories at the dinner table about the man who wanted to light up the valley. They were young and strong and eager in the way that young men are eager when they finally find something worth lifting for. They came without being asked. They came with their own tools, their own food, their own reasons. Some of them had lost jobs when the town started dying. Some of them had lost people. All of them had lost the feeling that their community was worth fighting for, and something about the sight of a limping veteran and a scarred dog working on a dead man's dream made them want to find that feeling again. Shadow moved among them all. He had a gift for knowing who needed him. He sat with the electrician while the man ate lunch alone. He followed the storewoman into the kitchen when she went quiet. He let the teenager scratch his ears and throw sticks for him in the yard during breaks, his tail wagging, his eyes bright, with something that looked remarkably like joy. And then, on the 14th day, Dot came. Callum was in the workshop, bent over a wiring diagram, when Shadow suddenly lifted his head from his paws and stood. His ears went forward. His tail began to move. He walked out of the workshop and down the hall toward the main entrance with a purpose that Callum recognized instantly. The dog had sensed someone specific, someone important. Callum followed. Dot stood in the doorway of the mansion. She had not entered the main house since the day Callum arrived. In 15 years, she had not walked past this threshold. She had stayed in her cabin close enough to watch over the property, but never close enough to live in it again. The house held too much of Henry. Too many rooms where his voice still echoed. Too many chairs where he had sat. Too many door frames he had leaned against, arms crossed, thinking. But now she was here, standing in the threshold with the morning light behind her, making her silver hair glow like something out of a painting. The shawl was in her hands, pressed against her chest, and Callum realized she was holding it the way a child holds a blanket in a dark room. For comfort, for courage, for the memory of warmth when the warmth itself is gone. She stood very still for a long time, her eyes adjusting to the interior, traveling slowly across the foyer, taking in every change. The swept floors that had been buried under years of dust. The repaired railings that Bert had spent 3 days straightening. The tools lined up in the workshop beyond, visible through the open door. The sound of hammers and voices and the occasional bark of laughter drifting from deeper inside the house where people were working. People who had not been here a month ago. People who came because something in this place had called to them the same way it had called to Callum, the same way it was calling to her right now. Her chin trembled. Just once. She pressed her lips together and steadied herself. Dot Ashford had survived 15 winters alone on this mountain. She had watched the town below her slowly empty out. She had kept a dead man's house standing through blizzards and loneliness, and the particular kind of grief that does not diminish with time, but simply becomes the air you breathe. She was not going to fall apart on the doorstep. Shadow walked to her and sat at her feet. He looked up at her and waited, patient as sunrise. Dot looked down at the dog. Then she stepped inside. One step, then another, then a third. Each one a small act of courage that only someone who has avoided a place for 15 years could understand. She walked through the foyer, down the corridor, past the library where the notebook had been found, into the workshop where Henry's blueprints covered every wall and his tools lay cleaned and arranged on benches, and his dream at last was taking shape in the hands of strangers who had become something more than strangers. Dot stopped in the center of the room. She reached out and placed her hand flat on the surface of the prototype that Callum and Linnea had been assembling. The metal was cool under her fingers. She closed her eyes. "He would have loved this," she whispered. Her voice trembled but did not break. "He would have stood right here and put his hand in this same spot and smiled that smile he had when something finally worked." She opened her eyes, and then she did the thing she had not done in 15 years. She pulled out a chair. She sat down. She stayed. Shadow walked to her side and lay down beside her chair. He rested his head on her foot, warm and heavy and faithful. Dot reached down and touched his ear, and this time when the tears came, they brought a small smile with them. A real one. Cracked and imperfect, but alive. Callum watched from across the workshop. He did not speak. He did not need to, because watching Dot sit down in a place she had been afraid of for 15 years told him something that all of Henry's words and all of his own anger had not been able to say. If she could walk back in, so could he. Bert, standing beside Callum, leaned over and said quietly, "That right there is why we keep going, soldier boy." For once, Callum did not argue with the nickname. Outside, the late afternoon sun poured gold across the mountainside. The sound of hammers and voices filled the old house. Shadow lay at Dot's feet, and Dot sat in her husband's workshop, and somewhere in the walls of the Ashford estate, 15 years of silence were finally slowly beginning to break apart. 18 days remained before the county deadline. The mountain winter was closing in, and the cold was getting meaner by the morning. And somewhere down the gravel road, Garrett Webb was already planning his next move. But inside the mansion, for the first time since Henry Ashford put down his pen and closed his eyes for the last time, the lights were on. The doors were open. And the people of Pine Ridge were building something together. Not because a dead man asked them to. Because a living one, a broken and stubborn and still breathing one, had chosen to stay. The last 18 days had changed the Ashford estate the way spring changes a frozen river, slowly at first, in cracks and whispers, and then all at once with a sound like the whole world remembering how to move. The workshop that had been buried under 15 years of dust now hummed with activity. Tools hung on pegboards in neat rows. Henry's blueprint, smoothed and annotated by Linnea's careful hand, covered the walls like a map of something that did not exist yet, but was getting closer every day. The prototype energy system sat in the center of the room, half-assembled wires and conduits reaching outward like the roots of a young tree, still deciding which direction to grow. Callum stood in the middle of it all on the morning of day 27, 3 days before the county deadline, with grease on his hands and a pain in his knee that had become so familiar it was almost a companion. Shadow lay in his usual spot near the workshop door, chin on his paws, watching the hallway in both directions with the patient vigilance of a soldier who understands that peace is never permanent. Bert arrived at 7 sharp, as he had every morning toolbox swinging from his left hand and a thermos of coffee in his right. He set the thermos on the bench, looked at the prototype, looked at Callum and said, 3 days. You ready? Callum wiped his hands on a rag. Linnea says the system is 90% assembled. We need to finish the wiring on the secondary panel and connect the prototype to the main junction. Then we test. 1 shot, Bert said. 1 shot. Bert nodded and reached for a wrench. Then he paused, pulled a folded piece of cardboard from his jacket pocket, and taped it to the workshop wall beside the door. It read, "If this works, I am naming my truck after the dog." Shadow lifted his head, looked at the sign, and let out a quiet chuff. "See," Bert said. "He approves." Silas came through the front door 20 minutes later, stamping snow from his boots. The weather had turned in the night. A heavy gray sky pressed down on the mountains, and the air carried the sharp, metallic taste of a storm still gathering its strength. Silas did not comment on the weather. He simply hung his coat, picked up a hammer, and walked to the section of the prototype where the wooden mounting frame still needed reinforcement. Linnea arrived at 9 with her leather bag and a thick folder of final calculations. She spread them across the kitchen table, where Dot had already set out coffee and a plate of biscuits that were slightly burned on the bottom, but made with the kind of care that has nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with wanting to be useful. Dot had been at the estate every day since the afternoon she walked through the front door and sat down. She had not missed a single morning. She arrived before dawn, opened the curtains in the kitchen, started the coffee. And by the time the others showed up, the heart of the house was already warm and lit and waiting for them. She did not swing hammers or read blueprints. What she did was harder to name and easier to feel. She held the center. She remembered to feed people when they forgot to feed themselves. She asked quiet questions that reminded Callum why he was doing this when the reasons got lost under the weight of exhaustion and doubt. And every morning, without fail, Shadow walked to her first. Before Callum. Before anyone. The dog would cross the kitchen, sit at Dot's feet, and rest his head against her knee while she drank her first cup of coffee. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. Neither of them spoke during it, but it was the part of the day that Dot waited for, and Callum suspected it was the part of the day that kept her coming back. The final 3 days blurred together in a haze of sawdust and solder and cold mountain air. Walt the electrician spent 14 hours on day 28 running the last of the wiring through conduits that Bert had mounted to the walls. Grace from the general store organized the supply shed with military precision, labeling every box and bin so that anyone who needed a specific bolt or connector could find it in under 30 seconds. Danny and Eli hauled materials from the storage building to the workshop and back, their young legs covering the distance that Callum's bad knee made impossible. And through it all, Callum worked. He worked past the pain in his knee, past the ache in his hands, past the exhaustion that pressed behind his eyes like a weight he could not set down. He worked because the notebook was open on the bench beside him, and every time he glanced at Henry's handwriting, he saw 2 things at once. The man who had dreamed this, and the man who had sent him into the fire. He could not separate them. He had stopped trying. He simply worked and let the work fill the space where the anger used to live. On the evening of day 29, Linnea called everyone into the workshop. "Tomorrow is the test," she said. Her voice was calm the way it always was, but there was something underneath it now. Something that might have been excitement, or might have been fear, or might have been the particular kind of tension that comes from knowing you have done everything you can, and the rest belongs to physics and fate. The prototype is complete. The wiring is connected. The solar array on the roof is feeding power to the main battery. Tomorrow morning, we flip the switch and find out if Henry Ashford's dream actually works. The room was quiet for a moment. Bert broke the silence. "And if it doesn't?" Linnea looked at him. "Then we have 24 hours to figure out why and try again. And if we can't, then Webb gets the land." Nobody spoke after that. The weight of the deadline filled the room, the way cold fills an unheated house, settling into every corner, pressing against every wall. Callum looked at Shadow. The dog was watching him, eyes steady, tail still, waiting for a signal, waiting for direction. Callum gave a small nod, more to himself than to anyone else. Shadow's tail moved once. That was enough. The morning of day 30 arrived under a sky the color of iron. Snow had fallen overnight, and the mountains wore fresh white caps that gleamed faintly in the gray light. The air was still. No wind, no birdsong. Even the pines seemed to be holding their breath. Everyone gathered in the workshop by 8. Bert, Silas, Linnea, Walt, Grace, Danny, and Eli. And Dot standing near the back. Her gray shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her hands clasped in front of her. She was holding the shawl the way she always did when she was thinking about Henry, holding it close enough to smell the wool, as if somewhere deep in the fibers, after all these years, there might still be a trace of him left. Shadow stood beside Callum at the main workbench, where the prototype sat connected to the junction panel by a web of wiring that Linnea had spent weeks designing and Walt had spent days installing. A single switch on the panel would send power from the solar array through the prototype and into the main circuit. If it worked, the system would generate enough clean energy to power the town's essential buildings. If it worked, the Eden Project would be real. If it worked, the land would be saved, and Webb would have no legal ground to stand on. If it did not work, everything they had built in 30 days would become a monument to failure, and the auctioneer's gavel would fall before the week was out. Callum placed his hand on the switch. His fingers were steady. His knee ached. Shadow pressed against his leg, warm and solid. But before he could flip it, the backup generator in the corner of the workshop kicked on with a sudden, deep, mechanical cough. The sound was low and percussive, vibrating through the floor and up into Callum's chest, and it was exactly the wrong sound at exactly the wrong moment. The workshop disappeared. The faces around him blurred and fell away. Sand rose in his vision. Heat poured over his skin. The sound became the sound of something exploding, something tearing apart, something that used to be a vehicle with people inside it. His hand left the switch. His body locked. His breathing stopped, caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat, like a word he could not say. Shadow was already moving, but not the way he had moved before. Not the full body press, not the weight against the legs. This time, the dog simply walked in front of Callum and sat, facing him, looking up. Then Shadow lifted one paw and placed it gently on Callum's boot. That was all. One paw. One point of contact. A small, deliberate touch that said, "I am not pulling you back this time. I am standing here so you can find your own way." And this time, something different happened. Callum breathed. Not because Shadow guided him back. Not because the dog's rhythm pulled him out the way it had pulled him out a dozen times before, but because Callum chose to breathe. He looked down at the paw on his boot. He felt the small weight of it, and he made the decision consciously, deliberately to come back. Not following, not matching, choosing. "I'm here," he said. His voice was rough, but present. "I'm not there anymore. I'm here with you." Shadow looked up at him, and for the first time, the dog's tail wagged during a recovery. A slow, small wag that said something new. Something that looked from where Silas was standing near the wall, remarkably like pride. Callum steadied himself, placed his hand back on the switch. "Here we go," he said quietly. He flipped the switch. The prototype hummed. A low vibration ran through the workbench and into the floor. The lights on the junction panel flickered. The hum grew louder, filling the workshop with a sound like a machine waking from a long sleep, stretching, testing its own strength. Then it stopped. The hum died. The lights went dark. The prototype sat silent on the bench, inert and cold. Silence. Heavy and absolute. The kind of silence that follows a held breath when the answer is no. Bert took off his cap and ran his hand over his head. Grace pressed her fingers to her lips. Danny and Eli looked at each other. Silas stared at the floor. Dot's hands tightened on her shawl. She did not make a sound, but Callum saw her knuckles go white, and he understood that she was holding on to the last piece of Henry she had, and the last piece of hope she had carried into this room. Callum stared at the dark panel. His jaw worked. His hands hung at his sides. Linnea was already moving. She knelt beside the junction box, pulled a multimeter from her bag, and began testing connections with the focused calm of a surgeon who has lost patients before and knows that panic is the enemy of precision. 3 minutes passed. 5. The room did not move. Nobody spoke. Shadow sat perfectly still beside Callum, ears forward, watching Linnea work the way he watched everything with attention and patience, and the absolute belief that the people around him would find their way. "Here," Linnea said. She pointed to a connection point where 2 wires met inside the junction box. "The secondary relay. It's not seated properly. The contact is incomplete." She looked up at Callum. "I can fix this. 2 minutes." Callum nodded. His throat was too tight for words. Linnea pulled a small screwdriver from her kit and adjusted the relay. Tested it with the multimeter. Adjusted again. Tested. The room watched her hands the way an audience watches a surgeon's hands, with the understanding that everything depends on movements too small to see from a distance. "Done," she said. She stood and stepped back. "Try again." Callum looked at the switch. He looked at Dot, whose eyes were fixed on the prototype with an intensity that bordered on prayer. He looked at Shadow, who looked back at him with those steady brown eyes and held his gaze without flinching. He put his hand on the switch, breathed in, breathed out, and flipped it. The hum returned. Low at first, almost uncertain, as if the machine was asking permission to exist. Then it grew. Steadier. Deeper. The vibration ran through the bench, through the floor, through the soles of Callum's boots, and up into his chest. The junction panel lights flickered once, then twice, then held. Green. Steady green. One by one, the indicator lights along the panel came alive, each one confirming that power was flowing where it was supposed to flow. And then, softly, like dawn breaking through clouds after a week of rain, a blue glow appeared in the heart of the prototype. Not bright, not harsh, soft and clean and steady, spreading outward through the transparent casing, illuminating the circuits and conduits that Henry Ashford had designed in his notebooks decades ago, that his grandson had built with his own scarred hands in the span of 30 desperate days. The Eden Project was alive. For 3 full seconds, nobody breathed. Then Bert let out a sound that was half shout and half sob, a noise so raw and so unexpected from a man that large that it shattered the silence like a stone through glass. He grabbed Silas by the shoulders and pulled him into a hug so fierce it lifted the smaller man off his feet. Silas stood rigid for a moment, stunned, and then his arms came up slowly, and he held on. And his eyes, those quiet, burdened eyes that had seen too much and said too little, filled with water that he did not try to hide. Linnea smiled, not her careful professional smile. A wide-open, unguarded smile that transformed her face and made her look for one moment like a woman who had forgotten she was supposed to be composed. She pressed both hands flat on the workbench and laughed a single bright note that rang off the stone walls. Walt stood at the back of the room with tears running down his cheeks, nodding to himself. Grace had both hands over her mouth, eyes shining. Danny and Eli were punching each other's shoulders the way young men do when they feel something too big for words. Shadow rose to his feet. His ears went forward. His tail lifted and began to wag, not the cautious wag he gave to strangers, but the full, sweeping wag that meant he understood something important had just happened. His eyes were bright, and he looked from face to face around the room as if memorizing the moment. And Dot. Dot stood in the back of the workshop with her gray shawl pressed against her chest. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were moving, forming a single word over and over, soundless, a word meant only for her and for the man who was no longer here to hear it. Henry. 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 When she opened her eyes, she was crying. But the tears were different now. They were not the tears of a woman grieving alone in a cabin on a mountain. They were the tears of a woman who had just watched her husband's dream come to life in the hands of his grandson, surrounded by strangers who had become family in a house that was no longer empty. Callum stood in the center of the room. He did not shout. He did not cry. He did not say a word. He placed his right hand on Shadow's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur beneath his palm, feeling the steady heartbeat that had carried him through every dark night and every impossible morning since the war. Then he looked up. Above the workbench on the wall hung a framed photograph that Dot had placed there the week before. Henry Ashford, young, in his workshop, smiling the way a man smiles when he is in the middle of building something he believes in. Callum looked at the photograph for a long time. The workshop noise faded. The voices of the people around him softened into a hum. For a moment, it was just Callum and the photograph, a grandson and a grandfather, separated by death and distance, and a betrayal that had reshaped both their lives in ways neither of them chose. He did not say, "I forgive you." Those words were too big and too complicated, and maybe not entirely true. Forgiveness was not a switch you could flip. It was not a single moment. It was more like the prototype on the bench beside him, something you built over time, connection by connection, until one day the current finally flowed. He was not there yet. Maybe he would never be all the way there, but he was closer than he had been 30 days ago, standing on the front steps with a dead man's letter in his trembling hands. What he did was smaller, and in its smallness, more honest. He nodded. Once. A single slow dip of his chin directed at the face in the photograph. A face that had loved him badly and brilliantly, and from too far away to touch. It was not absolution. It was acknowledgement. It said, I see what you were trying to do. I see that you failed. I see that you tried anyway. And I finished what you started. That will have to be enough. Dot saw the nod. She pressed her shawl against her heart, closed her eyes again, and whispered so softly that only the air could hear it, He sees you, Henry. He sees you. The week that followed moved at a different speed, slower, warmer, as if the valley itself had exhaled and settled into something gentler. The county inspector came on day 31, reviewed the property, confirmed the Eden project was functional and the land was in active use, and filed the paperwork that formally blocked any auction. Webb's lawyers sent a letter 2 days later withdrawing their bid. No one read it aloud. Bert used it to line Shadow's water bowl, which he considered a more appropriate use for the paper. And then, on a Saturday that smelled of pine and cold sunshine, the people of Pine Ridge gathered at the Ashford estate for the first time in anyone's memory. It was not a festival. It was not a celebration. It was something quieter and truer than either of those words. It was a gathering. People brought food. People brought chairs. Someone strung lights along the porch railing, and someone else carried a folding table out of the general store and set it up in the yard. Children ran between the trees. Old men stood in small groups with their hands in their pockets, talking about things that had nothing to do with energy systems and everything to do with the feeling of being part of something again. Callum stood at the edge of it, all his back against the stone wall of the mansion, watching. He was not good with crowds. Had not been since the war. The noise pressed against him, not threatening but insistent, like a hand on his shoulder that he could not quite identify. Shadow sat at his feet, one ear turned toward the gathering and one turned toward Callum, splitting his attention the way a good soldier divides his watch between the horizon and the man beside him. That was when Callum saw the boy. He was sitting on the porch steps apart from the other children with his knees pulled up to his chin and his arms wrapped around his shins. He was maybe 8 years old, with sandy hair and eyes that were too watchful for a face that young. Every time a door closed or someone laughed too loudly or a plate was set down too hard on the table, the boy flinched. Small controlled flinches, the kind you learn to make when you are trying very hard not to let anyone see that you are afraid. Callum recognized those flinches. He had made them himself in trailers and waiting rooms and grocery store parking lots for years after coming home. He recognized the posture too, the tightness, the careful stillness. The way the boy's eyes tracked movement in the yard the way a sentry tracks movement on a perimeter. This was a child who lived with someone else's war. Callum walked over slowly, favoring his left knee, making sure his footsteps were audible so the boy would not be startled. He lowered himself onto the step beside the child, leaving a comfortable distance between them. Shadow followed, and without any command or signal, the dog walked past Callum and sat down directly beside the boy, close, but not touching, offering his presence without demanding anything in return. The boy looked at Shadow, his arms tightened around his knees. "Is he safe?" the boy asked. His voice was small and careful. "He is," Callum said. "His name is Shadow. He was in the army, same as me. He is retired now. He spends most of his time sleeping and stealing biscuits from the kitchen when nobody is looking." The boy almost smiled. Almost. "You can touch him if you want," Callum said. "Put your hand on his back, right between his shoulders. Feel him breathe." The boy hesitated. Then slowly he uncurled one arm and reached out. His small hand came to rest on Shadow's back, sinking into the thick fur. Shadow did not move, did not turn, did not lick or nuzzle. He simply breathed. Slow, deep, steady. The same rhythm he had used to pull Callum back from 1,000 dark places. The boy's shoulders dropped, just slightly. His breathing, which had been shallow and quick, began to slow. His fingers spread in Shadow's fur, holding on the way Callum held on during the worst nights when the only solid thing in the world was the dog beside him. "Feel that," Callum said softly. "His breathing. Try to match it. In when he breathes in, out when he breathes out. That is what he taught me when the loud sounds get too big." The boy breathed in, breathed out, in, out. His eyes softened. The tightness in his jaw eased. The flinching stopped. His small body, which had been coiled tight as a spring since Callum first noticed him, began to unwind. His spine straightened. His shoulders dropped. His fingers, still buried in Shadow's fur, relaxed their grip from holding on for survival to holding on for comfort. And that shift, that tiny, barely visible shift from fear to trust, was worth more than every blueprint and every calculation in Henry Ashford's notebook. "He is my friend," Callum said, "and he wants you to know that you are safe here, right now. You are safe." The boy looked up at Callum. For a moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. A recognition. A shared understanding of what it feels like to live in a world where the wrong sound at the wrong moment can send you somewhere you do not want to go. Shadow turned his head slowly and licked the boy's wrist. Once. Gentle. The boy's face broke into a smile so sudden and so complete that it looked like sunlight hitting water. "He likes me," the boy whispered. "He does," Callum said. "He has very good taste." From across the yard, Dot watched them. She stood near the kitchen door with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, and she watched Callum kneel on that porch step beside a frightened child, watched Shadow breathe the fear out of a boy who did not have the words to ask for help. Her eyes were wet, but her face held a smile that went deeper than anything tears could reach. She was seeing in that small moment on the porch the completion of something Henry had started decades ago. Not the energy system, not the prototype, not the blueprints or the calculations or the wiring. The real project. The one Henry never wrote down because it could not be drawn in diagrams or measured in watts. The project of turning pain into something that heals, of taking what was broken and using it not to fix yourself, but to shelter someone else. Callum had done it, without planning to, without knowing he was ready. He had become the thing Henry hoped he would become. Not a guardian of a machine, a guardian of people. The afternoon passed gently. Bert told stories that made the old men laugh and the teenagers groan. Grace handed out slices of pie that were slightly lopsided, but tasted like someone had put love into the crust where the sugar was supposed to go. Walt fixed a squeaky hinge on the front door that had been bothering Dot for 3 years, and she thanked him with a hug that surprised them both. Then, near the end of the afternoon, A small child, a girl no older than 4, broke away from her mother and ran toward the side of the house, where an old wooden staircase led up to the garden terrace. The stairs were rotten. The second step had collapsed inward months ago, leaving a gap wide enough for a small foot to fall through. Shadow saw her before anyone else did. The dog launched off the porch with a speed that belied his age and his injured leg. He covered the distance in seconds, placing himself directly between the child and the broken staircase. The girl collided gently with his broadside and sat down on the ground, more surprised than hurt. Shadow stood over her body, blocking the stairs completely, and let out a low bark, not aggressive, just firm. A bark that said, "Stop here, little one. This is not safe." The girl's mother reached them a moment later, scooping the child up with a gasp. She looked at Shadow, who stood calmly beside the stair's tail, wagging slowly, and pressed her hand to her chest. "Oh my God! Thank you. Thank you, boy." Shadow wagged his tail and returned to the porch with the dignity of a soldier who has completed a routine mission and does not require praise for doing his job. Bert, who had watched the entire scene from across the yard, cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "That dog runs this whole town better than the mayor does." Laughter rippled through the gathering. Callum looked at Shadow, who had settled back into his spot beside the porch step, and smiled. A real smile. Not the ghost of one, not the almost version that he had been offering for weeks. A full, unguarded, honest smile that reached his eyes and lived there. "He has been saving people since before I knew him," Callum said. Shadow tilted his head at Callum, one ear up, one ear slightly to the side, and the expression on the dog's face was so perfectly timed that even Silas laughed. A rare sound, rough and short, but unmistakably alive. The gathering wound down as the sun began its slow descent behind the western peaks. People drifted away in small groups, carrying plates and folding chairs, calling goodbyes across the yard. The lights along the porch railing glowed amber in the fading daylight. Callum walked the property one last time as evening settled in. Shadow walked beside him, matching his pace, adjusting for the limp without being asked. They followed the dirt path that curved behind the mansion past the workshop where Henry's blueprints still covered the walls past the garden terrace, where Dot had started pulling weeds earlier that week, past the old cabin at the edge of the property where Dot had spent 15 years waiting for someone who would never come home. The valley opened below them wide and quiet and painted in the deep gold of late afternoon. Pine Ridge lay in the distance, its rooftops catching the last light. Somewhere down there, a family was eating dinner. A child was doing homework. A dog was curling up beside a fireplace. Small, ordinary, precious things happening in a town that had almost forgotten what it felt like to have a future. Callum stopped at the crest of the hill and looked back at the mansion. Lights glowed in the windows, warm and steady. Through the kitchen glass, he could see Dot moving slowly, washing cups, putting things in their places. Through the workshop window, the soft blue light of the Eden prototype pulsed gently alive and constant. "We did it," he said softly. Not to Shadow, not to anyone in particular. Maybe to Henry, maybe to himself, maybe to the version of himself who had lain on a cot in a trailer in Wyoming and whispered just one peaceful night, believing that peace was something that only happened to other people. Shadow sat beside him. The dog's breathing was slow and even. His fur caught the last of the sunlight, the gray in his muzzle glowing warm. Behind them, Dot's voice carried across the evening air from the kitchen door. "Dogs always know the way home, Callum." He turned and looked at her. She stood in the doorway, shawl around her shoulders, lamplight behind her, and for a moment she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had waited a very long time and had finally been given a reason to stop. Callum looked at the mansion with its lit windows and its warm kitchen and its blue glow pulsing in the workshop. He looked at the valley below, where the town sat quietly in the dusk. He looked at Shadow, who looked back at him the way he always did, with patience and loyalty and the absolute certainty that wherever Callum went, he would follow. Home. The word had meant nothing to him for years. It was an idea other people believed in, a place on a map he had lost a long time ago. But standing here on a hill above a valley where people had gathered to build something together, where a frightened boy had learned to breathe from a dog, where an old woman had finally walked back into the house she loved, where a broken veteran had chosen to stay when every part of him wanted to run, the word began to find its shape again. Home was not a place without pain. Home was the place where you did not have to carry your pain alone, where someone left the light on, where a dog lay at your feet without being asked, where an old woman opened the curtains every morning because she believed someone would come, where a stranger showed up with a toolbox and a bad joke and stayed until the job was done, where a quiet man sat beside you on a porch and told you about his son and the lightning, not because he wanted sympathy, but because he trusted you enough to let you see the wound. That was home. Not a building, not an address. A choice. The choice to stay. The choice to let people in. The choice to build something together and call the building of it enough. He walked back toward the mansion. Shadow walked beside him. Their two shadows, one tall and limping, one four-legged and steady, stretched long across the frozen ground in the last golden light. Callum sat down on the stone steps of the front porch. Shadow lay beside him, head on his paws, body warm against Callum's leg. The evening was quiet. Not the empty quiet of the trailer in Wyoming. A different kind. The kind that comes after a house has been full of voices and laughter and now holds the memory of them like warmth in the walls. Callum placed his hand on Shadow's back, felt the rise and fall, the rhythm that had saved him, the heartbeat that had held him to the earth when everything else tried to pull him away. They sat together as the stars came out one by one over the mountains. Then Shadow lifted his head. His nose pointed toward the tree line to the north, a direction they had not yet walked. His ears went forward. His tail began to move. Not a warning wag, an interested wag, a curious wag. The wag of a dog who has caught a scent on the wind that promises something new. Callum watched him. A breath of wind came down from the mountains carrying the smell of pine and snow and distances that had not been traveled yet. Again, Callum said. Shadow looked at him, those brown eyes still sharp, still steady, still carrying the same loyalty that had crossed deserts and survived explosions and blocked doorways and breathed life back into a man who had forgotten he deserved it. The dog barked, once, clear and strong. The sound rang across the valley and came back changed softer like an echo that had found something to believe in. Callum smiled. The real one. The one that had been coming back in pieces over the past 30 days, reassembling itself the way the mansion had reassembled itself, one repaired beam, and one opened curtain, and one lit lamp at a time. He stood. Shadow stood beside him. The two of them looked out at the dark tree line, and beyond it, the mountains, and beyond them, the wide open country that stretched toward whatever came next. "All right, buddy," Callum said softly. "But tonight we stay home." Shadow's tail wagged once more. He turned and walked back toward the open door of the Ashford estate, where warm light spilled across the threshold, and the smell of Dot's coffee drifted out into the mountain air. Callum followed, one hand on the door frame as he stepped inside, his limp barely noticeable, his shoulders straight. The door stayed open behind them, not because they forgot, because some doors are better left open. For the wind, for the light, for whoever might need to find their way in from the cold. If you are carrying something heavy today, just take one more step forward. That is enough. One step, one breath, one moment of choosing to stay when everything in you says run. That is how healing begins. Not all at once, not in grand gestures, in small, stubborn, ordinary acts of showing up. And if you have ever had a loyal friend, a dog, a person, a quiet voice on the other end of a late-night phone call who stood between you and the door when you were ready to walk away from everything, then you already know what Callum learned on a cold night in a dark hallway in the mountains of Colorado. You are not alone. You were never alone. And the ones who love you, the real ones, the steady ones, the ones who show up without being asked and stay without being thanked, they already know the way home, even when you have forgotten it yourself. Tell us in the comments, what loyal friend helped you keep going? We would love to hear your story. And if this one meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss the next journey. We will see you in the next one.